Ahoy and welcome back to Leia's Library. Find yourself a cozy corner, get yourself something nice to drink, and let's get started. Today we are wrapping up August. There is a better way to say that. Today we're doing the August wrap-up, going over all the books that I read in the month of August of this... Wow, hello! Somebody has opinions about what I read in August. So yeah, August this year, 2022. What did I read? Let's get into it. You will notice that this list is shorter than usual. That's because I was on vacation and you didn't even notice because I planned ahead and had videos ready to go. I'm genuinely very proud of myself. Please be proud of me, validate me. Otherwise I cease to exist. Anyway, the first book that I read, which was my travel book, was Persuasion by Jane Austen, which is a reread. I read it twice before, I think, at least twice. And I decided to reread this again because I watched Netflix's adaptation of Persuasion and decided I wanted to actually enjoy Persuasion, so I picked up the book. So, Persuasion, I have a whole series on the Jane Austen books where I do talk about this one a little bit more, so I won't go too much into it, but Persuasion is a novel by Jane Austen. It is about Anne Elliot, who is a woman who's approaching her 30s. She's in her late 20s, so she's very close to becoming a spinster. And she was engaged before to a man named Frederick Wentworth, but all of her family did not want her to marry him because he was pretty poor at the time, and she's from a family of renown and of some wealth. As this book takes place 7 years after their engagement was dissolved, and Wentworth is back in town, only he's now made a fortune, and Anne's family has fallen into a little bit of some hard times. And now the two have a chance to rekindle what they once had. Again, I talked about this book a lot in the other video. I really like Persuasion, and I would thoroughly recommend it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The first time I read it, I really didn't like it. I thought it was very boring. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. But then I reread it, and I was like, oh wait, no, I actually enjoy this. And I just read it again, and I can confirm I do enjoy this. So the next book that I read was The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin by Kip Wilson. This is a YA LGBTQ+ historical fiction. It's actually a poetry. It's written poetically. It's not written in prose, which I didn't know going in. But so this takes place in Berlin in the 1930s, and our main character is Hilde, who is a former orphan. She comes of age and leaves the orphanage, and she's desperately searching for a job when she stumbles across the Café Lila. What is going on today? She stumbles upon Café Lila, which is a vibrant queer cabaret, and in the cafe she finds Rosa, who is a waitress and performer, and Hilde is instantly struck by her, and just as Hilde is beginning to find her own voice, turmoil erupts in the streets. So, like I said, this book is written very stylistically, it's written very poetically, it's not a prose book, and it's very beautifully written. I think I would have preferred it had it been a prose book. That is just my personal preference, but I also think it just would have worked better to, fill some things out a little bit more. But take that with a grain of salt, because I just prefer reading prose books. What I think this book did very well was there's a really nice contrast between the cabaret world and the world of Berlin in 1930s. So I really enjoyed the joy of the cabaret and the self-expression in there and the life. It's so full of life and people just being outwardly gay and with no fear, contrasted with the rising dread in the streets as elections are going on and hate speech is becoming more and more common. There's a lot of tension that I found really effective in this book. And the whole book is very atmospheric, and because of the way it's written, it really it feels like you're getting swept up in it along with Hilde. You're getting swept up in the cabaret life, and then you're getting kind of the opposite of swept up, so you're like spiraling into the tension on the streets. It's very well done. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Zachary, Ying, and the Dragon Emperor by Xiran Zhao. This is a middle grade mythology fantasy. We follow this titular character, Zachary Ying, who is a 12-year-old Hui Chinese-American boy living with his single mom in the States. I can't remember where exactly in the States. But Zachary, because he grew up in the States and with a single mom who is often very busy working to try to make ends meet, he doesn't really know a lot about his Chinese cultural heritage. So he is woefully unprepared when he finds out that he is the descendant of the first emperor of China, which means that he's also the host of the first emperor's spirit. So the first emperor's spirit can possess his body, in theory. The first emperor of China botches his possession and instead ends up possessing Zachary's AR gaming headset. And in the process of this botched possession, Zachary's mom's spirit gets taken by demons. So now Zachary has to travel to China and try to save his mom and all of China from a leaking portal into the Chinese underworld, which will release a bunch of spirits during the upcoming Ghost Month. So this book is very similar to the Percy Jackson series in both plot and tone, just with legendary Chinese figures instead of Greek mythology figures. I also preferred the writing of this one over Percy Jackson. Not that I thought Percy Jackson was poorly written or anything, but Percy Jackson is stylized in a way that is very childlike, I would say. It's almost, it toes the line of hip with the kids writing, which kind of like took me out of it the first time I read it. I read it as a grown-ass adult too, so I mean maybe your experience is different if you were in the target demographic. But Zachary Ying is written in a way that as an adult I don't feel like I'm reading a children's book. I feel like I'm just reading a really good book that happens to be targeted at children. Whereas with Percy Jackson I was wholly aware that I was not the demographic. One thing that stood out to me in this book was the pacing. There is some truly breakneck pacing going on. Things happen so fast, and the characters are literally going from one moment of danger to the next, or like one dangerous plot point to the next, with very little pause in between. So as a reader, you just like, I can't breathe. Even the very beginning starts off like, bam, you are right in the story. We are getting the plot started as of page 1, which as a reader, I would have preferred like a little bit more breathing space. And like as a personal preference, I personally dislike when plot starts on page 1. I like to kind of dip my toes in the story water before submerging completely, as opposed to just like diving headfirst. Did that make sense? I'm all over the place today. I'm sorry. There's also a lot that's thrown at you in this book, like information-wise. And most of the information is integrated really nicely, but there were times when I was very aware, like, oh, this is an exposition dump. And it's necessary because you need to know the information, but for people who really can't stand information dumps, just know they are present. I thought all the information was fascinating because it was all about like different ancient Chinese historical figures or mythological figures, and I eat that up. I love mythology and ancient history stuff, so I was here for it. But if you are not here for it, be aware, it's there. So I love it when a book not only can tell me a really good, really entertaining story, but then also teaches me like world stuff, real world stuff. So the main character, Zachary, is Hui Chinese, which is a Chinese ethno-religious subculture that adheres to Islam. So Zachary is Muslim, as is his mom. And it's brought up in the book a lot how when people think of China, they think of it as sort of like a monolithic culture, when that's really not the case. There are plenty of subcultures within China, and it's not all one unified front per se. So Zachary finds it especially difficult to fit in anywhere because he's Chinese, but he's not what most people would think of when they think of a Chinese person, and he's American, but because he's Chinese American, he's also not what most Americans would immediately think of when they think of an American person. So he finds it really hard to fit in sort of anywhere, and there's a line that captures that really beautifully, I think. This is after he goes to China and he has met up with some other Chinese kids around his age. So it goes, "It was as if he'd been drifting as a lone leaf for his whole life, only to have found the tree he'd come from." And I just think that's really pretty. That was a really pretty way of putting it. Okay, one thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that it addressed the gray areas between like the good and the bad in situations in general, but mostly in people. For example, the first emperor of China did some great things. He's most famous for unifying all of China, but he also did some truly atrocious things, and both of those are depicted in this book, and he's not presented as some, saint, but he's also not depicted as this outright villainous tyrant. He's very much a mix of both. And I just think that was such a nuanced take for a middle grade book, so I really enjoyed that. Also, the ending in this book is very suspenseful. I really enjoyed it. Xiran Zhao is really good at the suspenseful endings, judging by their 2 books so far. Heck. So yeah, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It lost a star. I really enjoyed it, but it did lose a star for me because of the sheer speed at which everything took place. And the last book that I read in August was All That's Left in the World by Erik J. Brown. This is a YA LGBTQ+ dystopian romance, I guess. So in this book, a deadly pathogen has decimated the world's population, and the few remaining humans are desperately sort of fending for themselves. And one of our main characters, Jamie, is living in this isolated cabin all by himself when our other main character, Andrew, shows up injured and alone and with basically nothing left to lose. And despite their fear and what the world has taught them so far, they end up trusting each other. And when danger threatens the cabin, they end up fleeing south in search of civilization. So it mostly follows their trip down south. But both boys are keeping secrets. There are gaps in his story and Jamie's not quite sure what he's hiding. And for Jamie, well, he's starting to feel a little bit more than friendship towards Andrew. So I thought this was very enjoyable. I would say it's a very enjoyable book. It sufficiently entertained me. I didn't love it, but I think that had more to do with the fact that I don't read a whole lot of dystopian. It's not my favorite genre. I used to like it a lot more, but I don't so much anymore. So I think this book, it doesn't really add anything to the dystopian genre other than it being centered around a queer love story as opposed to a heterosexual one, which I think that was essentially the author's intention anyway. He mentions in a foreword that he really liked dystopian, but he was tired of there not being any queer representation in it, so he set out to make a queer dystopian story. And he did. He did just that, and it's a perfectly fine dystopian book. Do I feel like I've read this story before with a straight couple? Yes. But that doesn't make it bad. It is still a good dystopian book. It just isn't rewriting, it's not reinventing the wheel of dystopian. But that's fine. That wasn't the intention anyway. And the characters have really great chemistry, and they have a really believable romance, which is for people who have been around for a while, is very important to me. When there's a romance, it has to make sense. I have to believe it, and I believe these two. They're very cute. I really like them together. I fully believe that they fell for each other. Honestly, my biggest problem with this book is that it addresses the COVID-19 pandemic. In an author's note at the end of the book, the author says that he started writing it in 2015, so he had no idea what was coming. And then he continued writing it during the pandemic. And he said that the longer the pandemic went on, the more irresponsible he felt at not mentioning it in this book, which I understand. I understand that instinct, but it kind of took me out and made me believe things a little bit less, because in the book, this pathogen comes around shortly after the COVID-19 pandemic. The problem with that is that the reason this virus in the book killed so many people so quickly is because there were no lockdown procedures put in place until it was too late, which we just saw happen in the States with COVID. I mean, other places too, but this book takes place in the States, and the States was notorious for not wanting any lockdown procedures. And maybe this is naive of me, very well might be, but I have trouble believing that if another pandemic hit immediately after COVID, that there would be no lockdown procedures and it would just all happen again. Like, surely there would be more pushback now that we've seen what happens if this were to happen a second time so soon after the first time, especially because the bug in the book has these different symptoms than COVID. And another thing I think COVID had going against it, this is just my opinion, is that most of the symptoms were like cold and flu symptoms, at least like at first. That's what we thought. It was just like, oh, it's like a cold or a flu, but worse. So most people just kind of wrote that off. It was like, I've gotten the flu before, whatever. So people didn't take it as seriously as they should have in the beginning stages. Whereas this one, there's you get fevers that make you delirious and you start vomiting blood. And I feel like as soon as somebody starts vomiting blood, this is not good. You need to do something about these. You need to do something about this, that's a whole lot more concerning, isn't it? So yeah, that just kind of took me out of it a little bit. The virus in the book also doesn't have a name. They just call it the super flu or the bug, which also I have trouble believing now after all this. But yeah, all that being said, I think it was good. If you really like dystopian, I'm sure you will enjoy it. If you like queer stories, I'm sure you'd enjoy it. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And those are all the books that I read in August. Let me know what you thought of them down in the comments. Did you like any of them? Did you not like any of them? I'd love to talk about it. And if you want to find me elsewhere, you can find me on Instagram at Leia Like the Princess. You can also find my little embroidery and art store, Moonlit Cat Creations, on Instagram, or directly at the website at moonlitcatcreations.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay cozy.